Ladies and gentlemen, joining me now is Nicholas Wade, who's a science writer, editor and author who's worked on the stuff of Nature, Science and the New York Times. Today he's speaking to Republic TV. Good evening, Mr. Wade. Because a powerful piece you wrote about how the theory that COVID-19 escaped from a lab may not be far-fetched. And that has led to a global war of words, Mr. Wade. And it's put the focus on China. Once again, Mr. Wade, let me begin by asking you, you've created ripples globally with your piece, The Origin of COVID. Did people or nature open Pandora's box at Wuhan? What made you self-publish? Self-publish, I repeat, self-publish. And what has been the reaction at a personal level to your piece?
I self-published because I could write at great length, longer than most newspapers would accept. And the reaction has been very pleasing. Lots of people have read the article and discussed it. I've been waiting for someone to attack it, but no one has done so yet. So I'm hoping it will further debate and also put pressure on Chinese authorities to supply more evidence and tell us exactly what was going on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Until we get that evidence, we will never know exactly what went wrong or how to prevent another such pandemic.
Mr. Wade, a follow-up question. Have you faced any threats or any adverse responses to that piece that you wrote?
No, none at all.
Great. So wait, you claim a fact sheet issued by the US State Department on the 15th of January 2021 says that the US government has reason to believe that several researchers inside the Wuhan lab became sick in autumn 2019 before the first identified case of the outbreak with symptoms consistent with both COVID-19 and common seasonal illnesses. Now, if this is the case, why did it take your article to probably bring back the origin of the coronavirus into question and focus?
Well, it's taken a long time, I think, for people to understand the true nature of the facts, and that is because from the very start, virologists in the United States, including the organization that funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology with funds from the US National Institutes of Health, these virologists have launched a campaign to persuade people that the virus must have emerged naturally and that lab escape is out of the question, and that anyone who suggests lab escape is being critical of the Chinese. And so they're introducing many sort of political elements which shouldn't be there. And because of this campaign, I think people have been distracted from looking at the scientific facts and trying to figure out exactly what happened. And this mindset has prevailed for a very long time, for far too long. But I think people are now beginning to see that they should put aside all the political considerations. And in the US, these include particularly the fact that Mr. Trump has said the virus escaped from the lab without showing any evidence. So everyone who's against Trump is also against the idea the virus came from the lab. They should put aside all these considerations and just look as best they can at the scientific facts.
Mr. Wade, I'm glad you brought that up because a current WHO inspector, and his name is Peter Daszak, and you know him, you've written about him, was talking about coronavirus manipulation in Wuhan before the pandemic. And he has said, you can manipulate them in the lab pretty easily. There is an interview where he's quoted as saying that much before the outbreak. And yet the WHO has not conclusively identified Wuhan as the source of origin yet. Is there a vested interest of the WHO in safeguarding China?
Yes, I think that is fair to say. The WHO has been under far too much Chinese influence, and the Chinese government controlled who was put on that WHO committee, and they brought themselves a propaganda victory, but I think it was a very hollow victory that has blown back on them, because when that WHO committee went to Beijing, they came back saying, oh, lab escape is impossible. We're not even going to consider that. And yet when you looked at the actual evidence they brought back, expecting that they would bring back evidence of the natural emergence scenario, they were empty-handed. The Chinese authorities had been unable to give them any evidence that the virus had infected an intermediate host animal, that human populations had ever been exposed to it, allowing time for the pathogen to become more infective, nor had the Chinese authorities managed to identify the bat population from which the virus might originally have came. So everyone could see that the natural emergence scenario, which seemed so plausible to begin with, in fact, there was no evidence for it. Even 15 months after the outbreak, the Chinese authorities had failed to come up with a single shred of evidence in favor of it. So I think that when that, as that is now, even now sort of becoming clear to people, they are now giving more serious consideration to the alternative hypothesis that the virus escaped from the Wuhan lab.
Mr. Wade, you have alleged that the US National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is the NIAID, had funded research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, of course, it's a big talking point in America now, but Dr. Fauci, when asked that specific question, has categorically said, and I quote, that the NIH has not ever and does not fund now the gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute. Was there a lie, or was there an attempt to mislead or hide facts, perhaps?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I think we cannot give an answer to it yet. It's a sort of puzzling position on Dr. Fauci's part. I mean, one thing that is clear is that the NIH was funding research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Dr. Fauci is not denying that. He's simply denying that the kind of research involved gain of function. Now, I think there may be some sort of very fine lawyerly language that he's relying on, though he didn't explain his reasoning. There were sort of two separate grants given from the NIH to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the wording of one of them is slightly ambiguous, and the wording of the second one, which clearly specifies gain of function research, that grant was cut off and not completely funded. So it may be that somehow between these two things, Dr. Fauci has a view of events that is compatible with what he said in the Senate a few days ago, but doesn't really sort of change the overall fact that the NIH was funding dangerous research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Yes, and it's very interesting, the narrative around that, Mr. Wade. You know, you point out how, unlike common mutation that ensures a virus that affects bats begins to affect humans, the COVID virus hardly changed at all until recently, and from its very first appearance was well adapted to human cells. Is it possible that China willfully and with full cognizance created and released the virus? Is that a real possibility, according to you?
Forgive me, I didn't hear all of your question because unfortunately my phone rang.
Can I repeat that question for you?
To the first part.
Yeah. Do you want me to repeat that question? I can.
Yes, could you repeat the question?
Yes. You point out how, unlike common mutation that ensures a virus that affects bats begins to affect humans, the COVID virus hardly changed at all until recently, and from its very first appearance was well adapted to human cells. So is it possible that China willfully, perhaps, and with full cognizance created and released the virus?
No, I don't think so. There's no suggestion the virus was released deliberately. There's no reason to think that at all. But the first part of your question is correct. The virus, right from the beginning, was very well adapted to human cells. Now, that could happen if the virus was grown in the lab in what are called humanized mice. These are mice that are genetically engineered to carry a human gene such that their airways are very like the airway in the human body. So this would explain the virus's adaptation to human cells. It's very hard to explain that on the natural emergence theory.
Yeah. And a few days back, there was the report of the 2015 mention of the possibility of coronaviruses being used for possible biowarfare. And I'm taking you back to late January. In late January, China's top biowarfare expert, Major General Shen Wei, we are told, was sent to head the P4 lab in Wuhan Institute of Virology. Could this also be because COVID was possibly being weaponized as many experts believe? Do you think that's a possibility?
I think it's certainly a possibility that there is Chinese military involvement. But if there were, then my first expectation would be that the Chinese military was trying to make a vaccine against coronavirus to protect its troops. So this would be a normal routine activity followed by the military of any country, I think. And I see no evidence to support the idea that this was being developed as a bioweapon. I mean, it may be, you can't rule it out. It's just that there are so many other problems we need to address first, like whether the virus did indeed escape from the lab. I feel we should leave that one until later.
Yeah. And you know, you hear many world leaders talk about it. Some of the worst hit countries have spoken about it. The US, of course, until Trump was there. Brazil, the head of Brazil, UK, countries that were competitors and a threat to China in one field or the other. The heads of state are questioning China. There's a trade war on with the US and China. Brazil and India are emerging as alternative economies. So there's also been a border dispute with India and China. So, you know, all of these also lead us to ask some questions to which answers are not readily available. And of course, the question is, could it have been a calibrated Chinese plan to which we don't really have answers now?
Well, I'm not an expert on these things. I just try and look at the science, but it just seems to me unlikely that the Chinese would develop, let alone release a bioweapon. I just see no evidence for that.
Yeah. And as a journalist, you know the impact information and narrative can have. Do you find it curious that the Chinese began also spreading news with wolf warrior diplomats, as they call them, and ensuring foreign nations entered into content sharing agreements for one, and memorandum of understanding with several state-sponsored media? Do you feel that somewhere there has been an attempt to maybe cause a pandemic and then control the, at least control, forget about the pandemic part, but at least control the discussion on it globally?
Yes, certainly there has been a serious attempt by the Chinese authorities to control the discussion about the pandemic. I'm starting with the fact that they have refused to release any evidence about what was happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They have closed down all their databases that hold information about viruses. They've put out just little bits and pieces of information which I think are probably either false or designed to mislead or misdirect. So definitely there is an attempt to control the discussion that until now has been very successful.
Yeah. And you have spoken of how SARS-1 and MERS viruses also left copious traces in the environment. Why has no evidence similarly been presented for SARS-CoV-2, which is the coronavirus as we know it now, the COVID-19? Is it because there isn't any? What should be the way ahead, Mr. Wade?
Well, to your first question, yes, presumably the fact that no evidence has been presented means the Chinese authorities possess none. Yep. And that means the virus did not emerge naturally, but escaped from the lab in Wuhan. So the way ahead, I think, to me, it's very clear, just looking at it from a scientific perspective. What I would like to see is committees of distinguished scientists in every country, including particular scientists in India, and they should come together, scientists of all views and opinions, and they should write a report and say, well, although we have no direct evidence about this, we think on the evidence we have available, the most likely scenario is that the virus escaped from the lab in Wuhan. So it is now up to you, China. The ball is in your court. It is up to you to give us the evidence we need so we can decide one way or another. And if you do not give us this evidence, we will find it very hard to trust you again, to communicate, to collaborate with your scientists, or to have any dealings with you until you make clear whether or not you were responsible for this terrible pandemic.
Yes. Mr. Wade, a couple of more final questions to you. Now, it is documented that researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were doing experiments designed to make coronaviruses infect human cells and humanized mice. So why is there not a global call to ensure a real and full investigation into it? What's the follow-up? Because we've tried with the WHO and failed miserably.
Well, there should be a follow-up, but the Chinese are going to resist it until sufficient pressure is put on them to cooperate with us and show us scientifically what happened. And I think the way to exert that pressure is, as I just said, for scientists in every country in India and Europe and the US, all to either come together or write their own separate reports and say, on present evidence, it looks like the virus came from the lab. So now, China, you must provide the evidence. I think that's the best way forward. Yeah.
One last question. A few days back, another independent body, which was brought on board by the WHO, gave its opinion, asking for more powers to be given, more sweeping powers to be given to the WHO to act more swiftly in a pandemic. Now, obviously, that body also failed to pull up the WHO itself. But what is, as a science writer, as someone who's observed how the WHO functions, now, what is your observation on what may have gone wrong and why we let what happened with COVID happen?
Well, if indeed the virus did escape from the lab, I think the immediate problem here is that scientists all around the world, not just in China, or virologists all around the world, have been doing these very dangerous experiments, these gain-of-function experiments. So their justification is, well, we know these viruses escape from animal hosts every so often and cause pandemics in people. So if we could just get ahead of nature by seeing what tweaks are necessary in the virus to make it become a human pathogen, then we would have the information to predict and maybe prevent the next epidemic. And under that justification, scientists around the world have been doing these very dangerous experiments in conditions that are almost certainly not safe enough. So that is the sort of background situation that led to the pandemic. And I think every country needs to review the safety conditions under which they let these experiments go forward, if at all.
Mr. Wade, thank you for speaking to Republic TV this evening. And I think your article has been well received across the world. And here in India, I can tell you, for one, it's been viewed and shared in proportion that I can't explain. And it's one of the biggest talking points. And I think it's one of the pertinent questions that needed to be asked. And for writing that, thank you very much. And thank you for speaking to Republic TV this evening.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.